never thought I'd end up hiding in a White Castle bathroom, but here I am. My name's Sam, and I'm just your average 20-something trying to get through life in one piece. But lately that's been harder than usual, and it's all because of him. It started a few weeks ago. I stopped at White Castle after work around midnight, like I usually do on Thursdays. I walked in and there he was, this huge, hairy guy sitting in the corner booth, staring at me. I tried to ignore him as I ordered my usual, a sack of sliders and a large soda, but I could feel his eyes on me the whole time. When I went to grab my food, I glanced over at him. He was still watching me, not even trying to hide it. I quickly looked away and sat at a table on the opposite side of the dining room. I unwrapped my first slider, but I had lost my appetite. The guy kept leering at me, and I started to feel sick to my stomach. I decided I needed to get out of there. I threw my uneaten food in the trash and rushed out to my car. As I sped away, I looked in my rearview mirror. The man was standing in the doorway, glaring after me. Over the next couple weeks, I started seeing him everywhere. He'd be parked across from my apartment when I left in the morning. He'd be sitting at the far end of the bar whenever I met friends for a drink after work. And he was always at White Castle. He was there every night I went, sitting in the same spot, watching me. My friends told me I was being paranoid, but I knew I wasn't. This man was following me, I was sure of it, and he gave me the creeps. He never approached me or anything, but something about him made me feel nauseous and terrified. Just yesterday, I spotted him peering at me from an alley as I walked to my car after work. That was the final straw. I decided I needed to take action. I thought about going to the police, but I didn't have any real evidence against this guy. So tonight, I'm hiding. I'm crouched here on the floor of the White Castle bathroom, hoping he won't find me. I watched him come in earlier and sit in his usual spot. It took everything in me not to turn and run when I saw him. I ordered my food to go, then locked myself in here. That was 10 minutes ago. I keep waiting for him to try to get in. Maybe he saw me come in here. Maybe he's just waiting for me to come out. My heart is racing, and my hands are shaking so bad I can barely hold my phone. I don't know what this creep wants from me, but I am terrified to find out. The slightest noise makes me jump. I just wish he would leave so I can get out of here. Okay, I just worked up the courage to peek out the door. His booth is empty. He's gone. I feel a rush of relief as I realize I can finally leave. I grab my food and head for the door, smiling to myself. I push open the door and take a step outside. Suddenly, a large hand clamps down hard over my mouth. Before I can even react, I'm yanked backwards off my feet. I try to scream, but no sound comes out. Thought you could hide from me. His deep, raspy voice whispers in my ear as he drags me down the alley. I gasp for breath, clawing at his hand. He presses a rag over my nose. It smells sweet, and my head starts spinning. The last thing I see before everything fades to black is his sick, grinning face staring down at me. I have no idea what's coming next. All I know is this is the end of the line for me. My name is Katie, and I have always loved White Castle. There's just something about those little square burgers that I can't get enough of. I probably eat at my local White Castle 3 or 4 times a week. About 6 months ago, I started to feel like I was being watched whenever I went to White Castle. At first, I figured it was just my imagination, but over time, the feeling grew stronger. Whenever I looked around the restaurant, I never saw anyone who seemed to be staring at me, but I could not shake the uneasy feeling that someone had their eyes on me. The first real incident happened late one weeknight when I drove through the White Castle drive-thru after work. It was close to midnight, and the dining room was closed. After I ordered at the window, I noticed a dark sedan parked sideways across 2 parking spaces near the door. The driver had the lights off, and I could not see inside very well. As I pulled forward to the window to pay, the sedan quickly backed out of the parking lot and drove away. A few days later, I stopped at White Castle for lunch. I decided to eat inside to see if I recognized anyone. As soon as I sat down with my food, I noticed a man sitting alone in the corner. He was dressed in a black hooded sweatshirt with the hood pulled up over his head. I could see him watching me through the opening in his hood. He did not take his eyes off me the entire time I ate. He had no food or drink. He was just sitting there staring in my direction. After I finished eating, I walked up to the counter to get a refill on my drink. When I turned back around, the man in the hoodie was gone. By this point, I was thoroughly creeped out. I decided to start taking note of any strange occurrences whenever I went to White Castle. I realized the creepy encounters seemed to happen most often late at night or when the restaurant was less crowded. One evening, I pulled into the deserted lot around 10 p.m. and parked under a burned-out lamppost. As I ate in my car, an old pickup truck pulled in and backed into the space next to me. The windows were tinted dark, and I could barely make out the silhouette of a large man sitting inside. When I drove off, the truck pulled out behind me. It followed me all the way home, staying 1 or 2 cars back. As soon as I pulled into my driveway, the truck sped off into the night. I started to dread my late-night White Castle runs. I never saw the man's face, but I could feel him lurking in the shadows whenever I came to the restaurant. His unseen presence haunted me. I switched up my schedule and stopped going to White Castle at night, but I still felt like I was being watched during the day. The man in the hoodie continued to show up sporadically, always staring at me from under the shadow of his hood. His haunting gaze terrified me. Other strange events occurred too. Car doors slamming in the lot at night, footsteps behind me in the restroom, a scraping sound on my bedroom window after getting home from White Castle. I could not bring myself to stop going to my favorite fast food place. The cravings were too strong, but I started carrying pepper spray in my purse for protection. I felt utterly helpless against this unseen predator. He was taking away my sense of security and freedom. One evening close to midnight, I pulled into the deserted White Castle parking lot, desperate for a snack. Against my better judgment, I went inside to order. The place was empty except for the lone cashier up front. As I waited for my food under the fluorescent lights, the front door suddenly opened. My heart froze in terror as the man in the black hoodie walked in. I considered running out the back door, but instead found myself unable to move. The cashier turned her back to prepare my order. The man stared directly at me and pulled down his hood, revealing stringy blonde hair. He smiled an ugly, twisted grin and slowly shuffled toward me, his hands in his pockets. As he leaned in close, I got a whiff of his stale sweat and cigarette breath. "I've been waiting for you," he rasped in a gravelly voice. "We have unfinished business, you and I." I stood paralyzed as he reached toward me. At that instant, the cashier returned with my food, oblivious to what was happening. I used the brief distraction to grab my pepper spray from my purse. As the man's fingers grazed my shoulder, I whipped around and blasted him directly in the face. He shrieked in pain, stumbling backwards and crashing through the front door. I raced to my car, locking the doors and peeling out of the parking lot. My hands shook as I sped away. Glancing in the rearview mirror, I saw no one following me. I have not been back to White Castle since that night. The mere thought of those little square burgers now sends shivers down my spine. I moved to a new town and have started eating at a different fast food place. But every so often, I get the uneasy feeling that I'm being watched, and I spot a hooded figure lurking in the shadows. It was just another late-night shift at White Castle. I'd been working here part-time while going to college for a couple years now, and I was used to the usual crowd that wandered in after midnight. Drunk college kids looking to soak up the alcohol with a sack of greasy burgers. Stone dealers who could never seem to decide what they wanted. Lonely truckers fueling up for their long hauls across the country. But tonight was different. It started off slow, just me and my co-worker, Jenny, trading small talk as we went through the familiar motions of running the grill and cash register. But around 2 a.m., this mysterious man stumbled in. He was unshaven, with wild, bloodshot eyes scanning the dining area. His clothes were dirty and disheveled. I thought he was just another intoxicated customer, but something about him gave me the creeps. He lumbered up to the counter and ordered a sack of sliders, his voice a deep growl. As Jenny rang him up, he just stood there staring intensely at each of us in turn. I busied myself getting his order ready, avoiding eye contact, but I could feel his eyes burning into me as I slapped patties on the grill. After what felt like forever, I finished up the order and placed it on a tray on the counter along with his drink cup. But instead of taking his food and leaving, he just kept standing there. Menacingly, Jenny and I exchanged nervous glances, wondering when he would stop acting so weird and just go. Finally, Jenny spoke up. "Sir, can we help you with anything else?" The man slowly turned his head toward her, his lip curling into a snarl. "Yeah, there is something you can help me with," he growled ominously. He began to walk around the counter toward us, and Jenny and I huddled close, terrified. As he came nearer, I noticed the handle of a knife sticking out of his jacket pocket. "If you don't want any trouble, you'll do exactly as I say," he said, glaring at me with those wild eyes. "Now go lock the front door." "Now!" I hurried to lock the door with trembling hands. This couldn't be happening. It was like a scene out of a horror movie. Once I locked the door, the man forced Jenny and I to the back of the kitchen at knife point. "Please, just take the money and go," Jenny pleaded, tears streaming down her face. The man let out a sinister laugh. "It's not about the money," he sneered. "It's about sending a message." He forced us to sit on the floor with our backs against the wall, towering over us with the knife held out menacingly. I sat there trembling, a million thoughts racing through my mind. Was he going to kill us, torture us? I looked around desperately for anything I could use to defend us or fight back, but the kitchen was small with no potential weapons. Jenny and I huddled against each other, sobbing and begging the man to let us go, but he kept pacing back and forth, muttering crazy things about darkness and pain under his breath. It was clear he was mentally unstable and disconnected from reality. I wondered if we would make it out of here alive. Please, Jenny stammered, her voice quaking. "Don't hurt us." The man whirled around, his face contorted in rage. "Hurt you," he roared. "I'm going to shred you both to pieces. I'm going to paint these walls with your blood." He lunged toward Jenny, grabbing her by the hair and pressing the knife to her throat. She released a blood-curdling scream that made my skin crawl, adrenaline and anger rushing through me. I sprang up and leaped on the man's back, making him drop the knife as we tumbled to the floor. "You little bitch," the man seethed, throwing me off of him. I hit the wall hard, my vision blurring for a second. Before I could get my bearings, his hands were around my neck, squeezing the life out of me. I gasped and choked, thrashing violently, but his grip was too strong. As my oxygen cut off, I felt darkness creeping into the edges of my vision. Out of nowhere, a deafening crash rang out. The pressure on my neck released. I gulped down air and my vision slowly came back into focus. Jenny stood over the man's limp body, a dented sheet pan in her hands. She had clocked him over the head, knocking him out cold. The man lay crumpled on the floor. Jenny dropped the sheet pan with a clatter and helped me up. We stumbled out of the kitchen, collapsing into a booth as we caught our breath. After composing ourselves, we called the police and paramedics, keeping a close eye on the still unconscious attacker. Within minutes, the parking lot was ablaze with flashing red and blue lights. As the police cuffed the man and the paramedics carted him off on a stretcher, Jenny and I recounted the whole horrific ordeal in detail. The police determined he was a seriously deranged man who had recently escaped from a nearby mental institution. After giving our statements, Jenny and I sat alone in the booth, shaken and speechless. We had survived the most harrowing night of our lives. The scene kept replaying in my mind like a bad dream. The man's crazed eyes, his threats, the feeling of his hands around my throat. I knew those memories would haunt me forever. As the sun began peeking up outside, the gravity of it all finally hit me. I broke down, sobbing into my hands. Jenny wrapped her arms around me, crying too. I was overwhelmed with gratitude that we had made it out alive. Our scars would heal in time, but we would never forget. Never again would I take for granted a late-night fast food shift. You never know when an ordinary night will suddenly turn into a living nightmare. I still remember that fateful night like it was yesterday. The bright neon lights of the White Castle glowing in the darkness as I pulled into the parking lot. I was traveling for work and hadn't eaten since lunchtime, so a late-night slider stop was just what I needed. As I walked in, the smell of steamed burgers and fried onions washed over me. My mouth was already watering. There were only a few other customers inside, spread out among the booths and tables. I got in line to order. While waiting, I noticed a man sitting by himself in the corner. He was unshaven, wearing dirty clothes, just kind of staring blankly down at the table. Looked like he was probably homeless. After ordering a Crave case of cheese sliders and a large fry, I took a seat at a table on the opposite end from the man in the corner. I could see him still just staring, not touching his food. My food came up hot and fresh. As I ate, I glanced around. The few other customers had left, and it was just me, the man in the corner, and the White Castle employees. The man hadn't moved, just staring. His eyes looked empty, like he didn't even see the table in front of him. I started to wolf down my food, wanting to get out of there as fast as I could. The White Castle had been practically empty when I came in, and I didn't like that it was now just me and this weird dude. I kept looking over, and he did not blink, did not move, unsettling. As I polished off the last slider, I looked up and was startled to see the man was staring right at me. Our eyes locked for what felt like forever, but could only have been a few seconds. I broke off the gaze and immediately started gathering my things to make a quick exit. I dropped my trash in the can and bolted for the door, relieved to be getting out of there. Reaching my car, I looked back at the building. Through the big glass windows, I could see the man again sitting still as a statue, facing the spot where I'd been sitting. A chill ran down my spine as I got in the car and drove off into the night. I wrote it off as just a creepy encounter and tried to put it out of my mind. I had to focus on getting to my hotel and preparing for my 9 a.m. work meeting. The next morning, I arrived at the office ready to start the day. As we were getting settled in the conference room, one of my coworkers mentioned seeing something crazy on the local news. There had been a murder at the White Castle down the street last night. My heart sank. I pulled up the story on my phone, and there were the details. Sometime after midnight, a homeless man who was a regular customer had gotten into an altercation with one of the employees. He brutally attacked and stabbed the young worker to death right there in the restaurant. I felt the blood drain from my face as I read on. The murderer had been described as an unshaven older man in dirty clothes, who had sat in the corner and barely moved for hours before the incident. It was the man from last night, the man who had stared relentlessly at me. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. I could barely focus as the meeting started. My mind kept flashing back to those empty eyes and how he had watched me as I hurried out the door. It could have been me. If I had stayed just a few minutes longer, that could have been me lying there dead on the White Castle floor. Over the next year, everywhere I went, I was looking over my shoulder for that man, wondering if he would remember me, if he would try to find me. The cops had never caught him that night. He had disappeared out the back door of the restaurant before they arrived, into the darkness. I had to drive through that town again for another work trip. Against my better judgment, I stopped at that White Castle for a late dinner. It looked the same, smelled the same. As I ate my meal, I kept scanning the other customers. I finished up, relieved to not see anyone suspicious. As I got to my car, I felt a presence. Spinning around, I saw him. The man. He looked exactly as I remembered, even dirtier and more unkempt. I fumbled for my keys, hands shaking. got in the car and peeled out of the lot, watching in my rear view as he stood there, watching me right back. It's been months, but I still look over my shoulder everywhere I go. I'll never stop looking. Never stop wondering when he'll find me again. Never stop reliving that night in the White Castle when I looked into the eyes of a killer.